all of you for being here. It's so exciting to see this space being used in the low season that we'd like to make a little less low around here. I appreciate the suggestion of this series from Mark. I appreciate Amy making it possible. We're calling this Up Close and Personal, the first in a new series of events where we're going to take a deep dive into this incredible permanent collection. So the first of many, hopefully. The next one, March 8th, is Kathy Manthorn, professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She'll be speaking about another object that relates to our upcoming exhibition. So do come back for that. The inspiration for this series is something that's in the collective memory of generations of art historians, something that happened during World War II when Kenneth Clark was director of the National Gallery in London. And that whole collection was squared away to salt mines in Wales for protection. But just one picture at a time was left on view as this way to build morale, and all kinds of public events were held around that one single picture. So decades worth of art historians were shaped by that close looking at a single object and seeing what kinds of stories can emerge, what kinds of discoveries and observations. So we're going to try a little slow looking together today and just focusing on this one object that you have probably never noticed before. It was tucked away in the dark in the library downstairs. You've certainly never seen it looking this good. Highlighted with our spotlights here in the Sharp Family Gallery, giving us a chance to look deeply into it. The reason why we highlight this object first and we start this new series here is that this is the inspiration for our upcoming exhibition. This is a seemingly simple, seemingly quiet, decorative little picture that has all kinds of interesting stories behind it. The most interesting to us at Olana, of which is the relationship between Heade and church. Martin Johnson Heade here, tropical orchid, circa 1870, seemingly a gift to Frederic Church. So there is this relationship I'm going to try to flesh out for you today in just about 30, hopefully lively, not too boring minutes, and there will be time for questions and conversation about this seemingly simple, seemingly transparent little picture. So I'll draw out some of these big picture themes, the motivation for this exhibition Mark alluded to, cross-pollination, Heade, cold, church, and our contemporary moment. That title of the exhibition suggests that we're thinking about both literal pollination, in the case of pictures of flowers and hummingbirds, pollinators, spreading reproductive information and creating these fragile rhythms of nature, and also the metaphorical pollination of ideas between artists. So we've got both happening in this object. I'm going to point out to you some of the ways in which this seemingly simple painting helps to crystallize and clarify some pretty stark differences of opinion between Martin Johnson Heade and our man Frederic Church. We'll think about why he chose to go in such a different direction than the maker of Heart of the Andes at Niagara, even though they had an incredibly warm, close, friendly, lively relationship that's documented in decades worth of correspondence. I will minimize referring to notes, but I selected out a few juicy quotes from that relationship over the years. I'll try to complicate this painting and show you some of the rather harsh critical responses a work like this has received over the years. One of these background contexts will be this challenging categorization of this painting. Heade we often think of as a member of the so-called Hudson River School. He's often considered a straight-ahead landscape painter. Here he's doing something that doesn't quite fit into any of our given boxes. There's a little suggestion of a misty landscape. It's sort of like a still life, but we're out there in a representation of a jungle, selecting out one small element of that jungle. And then there's this whole other world of botanical art and illustration. Art versus illustration will be another challenging subtext for this painting. So I'll start just with a little biographical background on Martin Johnson Heade. This is an artist who, in his own time, never achieved the success and fame of Frederic Church. He was 7 years Church's senior, but was often treated as the junior partner in this this friendship. He was a relatively minor artist of the 19th century who has only risen to great popular acclaim and gotten his name in the headlines of exhibitions like ours only rather more recently. So this is somebody who didn't quite find his market in the 19th century. He seems not to have been so good at the politicking and the maneuvering and the salesmanship that Church was really good at, for the most financially successful artist of 19th century America. So he flies a little bit under the radar. He trains initially with a folk artist, Edward Hicks, famous for those Peaceable Kingdom paintings you might have seen, worth a Google image if you haven't seen them before. These charming, they're sometimes called naive paintings of the lion and the lamb living in harmony in Eden, and often there's William Penn signing a treaty with the natives in the background. Very different from a painting of an orchid in Brazil, but this is his background. He's getting a basic training in portraiture, and that's his initial art form. He's trying to make a living as an itinerant portrait painter, based in Pennsylvania initially, traveling to Rhode Island and then on to New Orleans, and really struggling to make a go of it. So this is a very different story than the painter Frederic Church, a prodigy of art, seizes the public's attentions as a young man and is off to the races. So he gives us a chance to zoom out a little bit and think about the wider art world of the 19th century and all these other voices that are flitting through the ecosystem of Olana with rather less success than Frederic Church. This relationship comes together in 1858 when Martin Johnson Heade decides the portraiture thing just isn't working out, and he's trying to make a transition to landscape at a moment when landscape was a tremendously lucrative specialism to have, a moment that has sometimes been called the landscape boom, when there was a huge demand for landscape paintings. So he makes a strategic move. He takes studio space at the 10th Street Studio Building in New York City, the heart of the 19th century American art world, where Frederic Church also had studio space. William Merritt Chase, Albert Bierstadt, major figures of the period were based in this one special artistic milieu, each building these incredible environments for the creation and sale of their paintings, populating these lofty spaces of which we have some historic photographs with all manner of decorative arts objects, in the case of Albert Bierstadt, Native American art surrounding his paintings and creating this immersive environment in which to consider purchasing one of his works, seeing the claims to authenticity and study that lie behind his claims on the market's attention. So this is a fascinating environment, and Heade sets up shop there, taking one of those grand studio spaces at just the time when Frederic Church is at work on Heart of the Andes. And we do have useful evidence here. We don't have to just say, take our word for it. We know that Heade was fascinated by Heart of the Andes, and he writes to a correspondent about this. Church has an enormous South American scene on hand. He says there's about 5 months' labor in it, even with his rapid style of working. The detail is like a cabinet picture. So he is aware of that mode of landscape practice, the monumental, spectacular, panoramic, conspicuous, performative labor on a monumental scale. He sees that firsthand. He's astonished by it. He also comments favorably on Niagara. So he is clearly aware of that mode that is seizing the public's attentions, that is being written about by people like Mark Twain, that is just capturing this national attention. So you see us laying the groundwork here. It's fascinating that he goes in such a different direction with paintings like this one. He is as deeply acquainted as anyone with the process of making Heart of the Andes. He's seeing it firsthand. He's taking coffee with Mr. Church. They're building this lasting friendship, and he's learning from the artist 7 years his younger, who is so far his better in market success and in marketing savvy. So he's a part of that whole world, part of that whole process, but taking very different lessons from it. One of the lessons that he takes from Frederic Church is this impulse to travel to South America. And it's certainly clear that one of the key influences for Heade's own travels south was Frederic Church and his readings in the same books that Frederic Church was reading. Humboldt certainly is one of those figures. Reverend James Fletcher is another who wrote Brazil and the Brazilians, which is a book in the Olana collection, and I'd love to get that on view during our exhibition. A beautifully illustrated, lavishly produced book that gives an overview of the visual culture of this seemingly exotic land that was calling on the attentions of painters. So Heade is motivated by these conversations with church to make his own South American journey, which he then does in 1863 and 64, if memory serves. Travels to Brazil, not to Colombia and Ecuador, where Frederic Church's Heart of the Andes comes from, and so many other great pictures like Cotopaxi, Cayambe, the picture that we'll be speaking about next month when Kathy Manford comes in. So he's being motivated to travel south by Frederic Church, but he's going a rather different direction. His motivation for that trip is also very clear. He says to one other correspondent, I have always been since boyhood a monomaniac for hummingbirds. And he was fascinated by hummingbirds in particular. You see this kind of microscopic zooming in on the landscape that he was always compelled to, these smaller subjects, hummingbirds certainly, which will be featured prominently in this upcoming exhibition, but also orchids, the stuff of landscape, blown up to the grand scale of a full picture. The mode that we think of with Frederic Church in approaching botanical specificity is no less studied, no less scientifically precise, but consumed by a huge canvas all around that little specificity. So in Heart of the Andes, as you probably know, the famous tale is that there would be a small program you could purchase as you look through the picture that would guide you to all that botanical detail in the foreground. Even if it were only half an inch high, we could identify the precise specimen of plant that you're viewing there and better yourself by learning about the botany of the Andes in the process. So Heade, instead of doing that, instead of showing that he has studied all the flora and fauna of a vast and complex region, he focuses on just one species here. And he would do the same thing in the Gems of Brazil, the series of paintings of hummingbirds that will be the focus of our exhibition, an individual species of hummingbird in its environment, and you're learning a little bit about its life cycle, its reproductive processes, and then also the beautiful plumage, the color that makes them look like a gem, the gems of Brazil. So we see already that distinct difference of opinion there. There are some fascinating moments in the Heade Church correspondence where you see a pretty sharp edge to Church's recognition that Heade is choosing to go in such a different direction in his own work, even as they are making pet names for each other and having this very friendly, lively exchange. Church feels comfortable saying some pretty sharp things to Heade. In one case, a later trip that Heade makes to South America, to Colombia, has Heade trying to find one of the mountains that Church had painted there, Santa Marta. And he was not such an intrepid traveler as Church. He wrote back to Church complaining of all the insects and the rigors of travel. And this is what Church says in reply, and presumably he had built a certain amount of trust with Heade that this could have ended a friendship, in my opinion. I am ashamed of you for making such a fiasco trying to find Santa Marta. Why didn't you stick to it? I tell you, you have missed a big thing. It's an awfully good joke, and I won't tell Albert Bierstadt, only your good friends. It's a really sharp little moment there in their correspondence that stands out, where Church recognizes that this artist has a very different set of values, and he's not going in search of the same subjects, and criticizes him pretty harshly for it. You see throughout this surviving correspondence, of which, interestingly, we have a lot of Church material, but very little Heade. And it seems that Church did not preserve the Heade letters as rigorously as Heade preserved the Church letters, unfortunately. We see Church repeatedly in that surviving correspondence nudging Heade to make great pictures of these subjects, the subjects that Church too had produced. He asks him at one point after Heade travels, like Church, to Jamaica, are you at work on a good large Jamaican picture? And this is not Heade's goal. This is not Heade's preoccupation. He certainly never gets that same market success selling pictures for large sums. But from the backwards lens of the 21st century, we might start to see a picture of a painter who had a really original vision, And I'd like to present that more favorable vision of Heade today, that he was an original, that he did quietly dissent from this Hudson River School consensus, even as he was able to work in that same mode, even as he was making pictures of the marshes, the salt marshes of Newburyport, Massachusetts, lovely pictures of which we'll have a great example, likely right above the fireplace in this exhibition next in a few months from now. He does hone in this strange hybrid art form between these received categories, between these received market segments, and goes his own way with it. And he's not always successful in that, but sticks with it nevertheless. I want to dive a little deeper into this picture and think about just what we're looking at here and the kinds of stories that might lie behind it. Starting from the outside in, it seems very likely that this frame that holds it was actually made on site at Olana. This was an interesting discovery in the process of researching for this exhibition. You'll see frames like it around a number of the oil sketches downstairs. The objects that were for private enjoyment here at Olana rather than for sale out on the open market seem to have been framed by the same woodworkers who were working on the construction of the house in this fairly plain, useful, utilitarian frame here. So perhaps it was transferred within the studio at 10th Street in New York City, where while Heade initially has his own private space there, he's later actually a subtenant of Church's own studio. So they are working side by side, and we might picture an unframed object being gifted to Church and then framed up later by Church. What we're looking at within the picture is two different species of orchid, one of which is indeed native to Brazil and one of which is not. So we start to understand that this is not just direct observation and scientific accuracy. It's a little more complicated. The top specimen there, Cattleya labiata, is native to Brazil. You could readily see in that environment. I'll point out that you're seeing stages in its growth. You see the bud, and then you see the full bloom. You'll see that again down below with the dendrobium orchid, the bud and the full bloom, the dendrobium being native to Indonesia. So this is a specimen he could have seen in the original in botanical gardens that already existed in the mid-19th century US. There were specimens at Harvard. Another great collector in New York City, Thomas Hogg, had specimens of the dendrobium orchid. So he was able to see it in the original, but this is a composite. And that's also true of so many of the gens of Brazil that we'll be seeing later. He's selecting out specimens, showing them with their eggs and their nests in a way that would be incredibly rare to perceive in the wild, a subject that is still difficult to find. And he's making this composite that gives you useful information about the cycles of life and reproduction, and painting a kind of story around the life of these flora and fauna. So there are cycles latent here, even in this seemingly inert object. And that might start to get us to another of the values behind Heade's work and what makes him distinct from Church and Church's mode. One of the stories we often tell at Olana is of Church as a Humboldtian painter. It's a name you hear often. There's an exciting Humboldt exhibition coming up in just a couple of months, or is it next month? Opening next month at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. A friend of Olana, Eleanor Jones Harvey, diving deep into the tremendous impact of the German naturalist Alexander von Humboldt on the visual arts, and Olana is loaning to that exhibition because Church is so well known as the quintessential Humboldtian artist. What we mean when we call a painter Humboldtian is that you are following after Humboldt and seeking after these great rhythms and cycles of nature across climate ecosystems, layered landscapes from lower altitude to high, and thinking about how all of those layers and cycles mirror the greater plan of the divine. There's always that distinct spiritual message in Humboldt. So that seems to be a core preoccupation for Church in Heart of the Andes. It's a quintessentially Humboldtian picture. Its composition is not unlike some illustrations that actually appear in the pages of Humboldt's Cosmos, to which we've loaned Church's copy of that book to the exhibition that's coming up. So that whole worldview is part of what Heade is taking from Church when they're sharing studio space. there is a sense in which Heade seems to be a failure as a Humboldtian painter. He's no longer trying to give you all that information, these greater cycles, a divine plan. I was interested to hear from the preeminent scholar of Heade, Ted Stebbins, who will be speaking in conjunction with our exhibition later this year, that from his survey of Heade's correspondence, you don't find the word God once in all those letters. And this is really unusual in this spiritual world, the Great Awakening. We certainly have a vibrant religious life at Olana. Heade is very different in that regard. Another word you don't find anywhere in Heade's correspondence is a word that is frequently mentioned in the Heade reception history, and that I'd like to bring up again today, which is Darwin. And there is a reason to think that Heade is a quintessentially Darwinian painter. So I'll give you some little quotes from Darwin. We can certainly put him in the right place at the right time in correspondence with Darwin's advocates and defenders. We know Heade is corresponding with the great Harvard scientist Agassiz, who is often engaged in debates against Darwin's perspective. We know that Heade is aware of this bomb going off in the intellectual world of the 19th century world, but certainly 19th century New York, dealing directly with this challenge to a divinely ordered plan, a worldview, and seeing that there might be inner rhythms of nature that are proceeding under their own logic and their own scientific systems. So this, I think, is a convincing reading of this painting. I've mentioned that you see the different stages in the life cycle of two different orchid species. You're seeing the variety of species and their interplay, an imagined interplay that might not have existed in the natural world, but nevertheless one that thinks about how different specimens, different species come together and make new colors and forms. This is also something that's latent in the Gems of Brazil, where he's assembling useful information over, in the case of our exhibition, 16 of these paintings of different hummingbird species, one of which is actually a butterfly painting, but that's another story for another day. And he's looking closely at these hummingbirds as if they are gemstones, celebrating what is unique and different about them, and also depicting, again, their nests, their eggs, the conflict among species. Some of these paintings actually show battles between hummingbirds. So there's a suggestion of another part of Darwin's worldview. We've got Darwin here in The Origin of Species, urging us to pay attention to that kind of violence and conflict and death that's latent in the landscape. Darwin writes, "We behold the face of nature bright with gladness, but we forget that the birds which are idly singing round us mostly live on insects or seeds and are thus constantly destroying life. Or we forget how largely these songsters or their eggs or their nestlings are destroyed by birds and beasts of prey." So he's urging us to reflect in a way that sounds almost stoical on the presence of death in life, on these great cycles, and how we're all part of these larger rhythms, and perhaps a painting that gives us those senses of cycle, birth and death, spread of species information, the stages in bloom, might urge us to think about those larger rhythms. So I put that to you, and we can think about that a little later in the discussion period. Another of these tensions that's lurking in this painting is this challenge that is a gendered one, that there is this received wisdom in the 19th century that flower painting is a lady's art. So this will be a challenging part of this picture, and it's one of these mixed legacies that Heade is navigating and that Heade's own reception history is navigating. It's interesting to note that one of the first scholars to take Heade's flower painting seriously is a pioneering female art historian, Mary McCausland, I believe is the name, in 1945. Very early for people taking 19th century American art in general seriously. We have someone highlighting this body of work in contrast to those lovely salt marsh pictures and this more straight-ahead landscape work, and recognizing that there's something special here about these microcosmic landscapes by Heade. So there, as you may well know, there is a long history of botanical art and illustration as an art that is an acceptable pursuit for a lady. And we have popular writers, a book of 1829 that is encouraging ladies to take up botanical study as a worthy pursuit for moral betterment and also knowledge of the greater divine plan. Elmira Hart Lincoln Phelps' familiar lectures on botany, published 1829, tremendously popular, sells more than 400,000 copies. Books like these are urging women to focus on this sort of subject matter, not for commercial sale, but for their own moral improvement. So that's a whole body of baggage that is in the background when Heade takes on a flower subject. Our man Church here also criticizes Heade for taking up this subject matter. In one of these teasing, mostly playful, but occasionally sometimes rather sharp letters, he dismissively calls Heade a flower painter, spelling it F-L-O-U-R, playfully, like flour for baking. And then he teases him further, asking, are you painting any new orchids lately? And imagines a new species of orchid that he calls the Diabolica Headensis, and draws a little caricature devil in the stamen of an orchid. It's all very playful and fun, and we'll reproduce some of those original letters in the exhibition. But when you do accuse a fellow white male establishment privileged artist of being a mere flower painter, there's a really sharp edge to that criticism, and it's a further sign that Heade is taking a really unusual and interesting path here. Scholars have been at great pains to point out the male botanical forebears of his work, that there are other male artists in the European tradition who are taking flowers seriously, but they are usually doing so in monumental series not unlike that of Audubon, a great illustrated luxury book explicitly for market sale, explicitly a commercial venture, and with pretensions to scientific accuracy. They have not paid as much attention to the female precedents for botanical art of a very high level. It's especially significant to note that when we talk about the art of flowers and of botany, we're usually talking about watercolor, another medium that is reputedly a lady's art, a domestic practice, rather than oil on canvas. The fact that this is oil on canvas is significant. He is giving it the respect of the ultimate artistic medium, and he's not trying to make it merely for reproduction in the values of the time, merely to be published and spread widely to a ready and accepting public. So he's navigating between art and illustration. That's another of these key dichotomies here. When we're talking about illustration, we're talking about conveying useful, accurate scientific information. And he's not doing that here. He's giving us species that could not have existed together in the world, and he's also trying to evoke this sense of recession into space, a kind of landscape in the background. You'll note a little misty waterfall here in the foreground, and I hope you'll get a chance to come up and look at it later. You might think of that waterfall in Heart of the Andes as a repoussoir. It might lead you back into the picture. So this looks very different from those botanical illustrations where you'd have a flower silhouetted on a flat white background, extracted from its context and giving you just that minute detail of how it looks, how you can identify it in the wild. So he's already failing that illustration test in the choice of medium, in the level of accuracy, the way he combines these species, and then also in that strange hybridity that is also a work of landscape. He's also clearly departing from that illustration model in not conceiving of this series as part of a larger reproductive project. This seems to have been Heade's first, or one of his very first paintings of an orchid period. So it's a really important painting in the Olana collection. It's an unusual one in its composition, this kind of vertical, we might call it portrait format. It feels almost like a portrait of an orchid, giving it the same distinction that he gave his figures when he was a specialist in portrait painting earlier in his life. This is distinctly not the composition that he's best known for, and we'll see more of that in this upcoming exhibition. Paintings that are much wider than they are tall, very like that panorama mode on your cell phone that only captures so much information this direction, but a lot of information that direction. So this is a strange outlying object, and the fact that it it does seem to have been given as a gift to church is fascinating. It's certainly a beautiful picture, but this is the same painter who is dismissing Heade as a mere flower painter, who is needling him and teasing him about not painting those great volcanic peaks of South America, not being a hardier traveler and going off into the jungle to find them and complaining about a few bug bites. And Heade responds with this painting that does show in their own right in this monumental way. So he's navigating through a 19th century art world that didn't quite have a category for these things. This is a fundamentally non-commercial object gifted to a friend. It's not something for which there was a ready buying public. It's not being displayed at the National Academy of Design, of which he's never invited to be a member. He is on the verges of this art world, and then there's this uncomfortable truth that church may have just discarded Heade's letters later in his life. We have a tremendous archive here at Olana, and the Heade material is just lost, and we don't know quite why. So this figure was largely overlooked. He doesn't fit into any of our received categories, but I hope that you will find him as fascinating as I do, that he does offer this third way, this other path in 19th century American art. Not quite the poetical, allegorical landscape of Thomas Cole, not quite the imperial, expeditionary, maybe even expansionist mode of Frederic Church, depicting all the useful knowledge of this seemingly exotic continent to the south, but honing in with this intimacy and delicacy on some of the smaller details of that mysterious continent, and bringing back these subjects in all their own portrait composition glory. So please do come back and see more of Heade's work in this upcoming exhibition. You will see the relationship of this painting that's always here in Olana to the Hummingbird paintings that will be on loan from the Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas. I hope you'll see how these things are challenging, difficult, complicated, argumentative, urging us to think differently about the legacy of Frederic Church, offering a pretty pointed riposte to the grand visions that we know and love at Olana. So I'd be happy to transition into questions and discussion. I'm curious what you think about this, and I hope that you'll come up and look at it a little more closely, and look at it with me and see what we can make of it. Yeah, there's a question.
Well, a couple years ago, I'm a stamp freak, but I'm not a stamp collector. They had a stamp of Heade. And, what was that all about?
It's really interesting. So we also have, there's that U.S. Postal Service canonization that has happened to a number of these artists over the years. There is that great set, I wish I could buy more of, just the Hudson River School set. That was a few years ago. I think it's now out of print. Can't get it anymore. But there has been this whole restoration of the legacy of Heade. And he is now a tremendously important major artist who's selling for 7 figures. And that's largely due to the work of some pioneering female art historians in the early part of the 20th century, who are recognizing that things like this are not mere flower painting in the values of their time, but things that are very complicated, very sophisticated, and challenging objects that give us a lens into a rather original place in the 19th century art world. These things are easy to love, they're beautiful, and I think that sometimes we risk overlooking how complicated and challenging they can be.
Thank you.
Yes,
Did he have any followers?
You know, I've never heard any single student who studied with Martin Johnson Heade. He is so deeply forgotten. I think if he had any followers, they would have carried the torch for him a little bit. He doesn't seem to have been much engaged in teaching, so I don't know the single one. It's a good question, but it's a little bit shocking. He never was that establishment figure who other people wanted to come and study with.
Where can we see the portraits that he painted?
I will have to get back to you on that. I've never seen one of them in the original myself. They are very obscure, and there are just a few that I've seen in the pages of Ted Stevens' big catalog raisonné. The earliest, they do look like works of folk art. They're very awkward, very crude and outsider-ish, a voice from rural Pennsylvania trying to make it in the art world as a journeyman portrait painter. So there's a remarkable change that happens in this artist, but he sort of converts to this original mode in his 40s. So it's an inspiring model that you can totally change path in midlife and go a whole new route. I would love to see some of those portraits too, so we'll have to track them down. Yes, Judith.
This seems to have some areas that are kind of magical and mystical and delicate. Did he use many layers of paint? Did he develop techniques if by working you're corresponding on specific techniques with church?
That's a very interesting question. We can only wonder what they were talking about when they were sharing that same space at the 10th Street Studio building. But having read through all their surviving correspondence, I've never seen a comment that specific on technique, on a manner of applying paint. They're sharing tales of their travels and journeys and humorous incidents in the art world. It's a great set of letters to read through, but never that kind of technical precision. I'm sure there has been some technical study done of Heade now that he is so valued and important, and we could look into that. I'd love to see the great technique of sampling, where you take a microscopic piece of paint out of the picture and you look through it and see the layers. You might be onto something there. Maybe he does get that misty light that has sometimes been called luminist, which is a challenging term that not everyone adopts, through some new ways of applying paint and indeed new paint compounds. So that's a good observation. Haven't thought as much about the technical side. We should.
You focus on this work as almost a unique object, but how does it fit within the whole series of Hummingbird and Orchid paintings by Heade, which is going to be featured in the exhibit?
Yeah, it's almost unique as an orchid painting without any animal or human content. There may be one or two others, but almost always when you see a Heade orchid painting, you've also got hummingbirds. You've got some movement and energy around it. Some have called this a rather awkward early painting by Heade for that reason. I think if we think of it as kind of a portrait of a flower, some of that compositional awkwardness goes away. So it is an outlier in that content, but it does build towards his preferred format. And what we'll see in the exhibition are a number of others where you'll have this kind of natural still life with both orchid and hummingbirds arrayed in that panoramic mode that he adopts as his core composition. So this is him working out some of those ideas, and then we will see the mature orchid and hummingbird painter after the Gems of Brazil, with a great loan from the Reynolda House Museum of American Art in the exhibition, showing him creating these whole environments. And what's so interesting for the purposes of this exhibition is that you see the pollination context, that these birds are pollinators spreading pollen as they go from flower to flower. So it's especially fascinating when he does give you both the flower and the bird. Yes.
Do we know how Church felt about this painting, or where did he display it prominently, or did he toss it in the attic?
It's a good question. So often we wish that we had more direct comments by Frederic Church on these things. We know that it was displayed in the house. We know that there is this really interesting context with other botanical artists coming to Olana. So we were really hoping that we would see one of these pioneering woman artists who's represented in the Olana collection just a few rooms over, commenting on it. This woman named Marianne North, who is tremendously important, hugely accomplished. And my colleague Ida, the librarian and archivist of Olana for many years, helped me going through Marianne North's correspondence, hoping that on her visits to Olana, she would have commented on this thing so much in her wheelhouse. And we can't find that one juicy tidbit, alas. It does seem to have been on view here for many years. It would have been visible to these generations of artists who came through this special environment, but we don't have that one smoking gun, that piece of evidence, alas. Yes, Sarah.
Do you think there's any possibility that because this is really not a botanical study, I mean, he said it in a landscape, it's an anti-still life, in that it's not a still life. I mean, and in the later ones he has more movement with the hummingbird, but it is also an overtly very sexual flower.
Absolutely.
And that this was, particularly as the late Victorian period kicked in, perhaps artists not wanting to comment on something that would have essentially been seen as slightly indecent.
That's right. Yeah, it's been fascinating to learn from looking deeply into this picture. It seems so inevitable to us now that you would select out this glorious specimen for paint. But both before and after Heade, hardly anyone is painting orchids. It's a very rare practice, and I think you're onto something there. They do feel a little bit indecent, and they do kind of have this florid performance of their reproductive capacity that is could potentially uncomfortable for Victorian mores. So you've suggested that it is an anti-still life. I've suggested Heade coming from this earlier Hudson River School mode that it might be an anti-landscape. You're right, and I think I'm right too, that it's somewhere in between all of these genres. I've been fascinated by the recent work of a scholar who spoke across the river recently, Maggie Chow, who's been thinking about Heade as a practitioner of anti-landscape in particular, a painter at the end of that 19th century landscape boom who was recognizing that tastes were changing, who was starting to be a naysayer of that imperialist, triumphalist, optimistic mode before the Civil War, and starting to offer a narrower vision that also bears out some pessimism about the American experiment. That's a fascinating argument and a useful thing to keep in mind when we're looking at Heade. Yes, Mary?
That, as you talk about anti-triumphalism, I'm sitting here looking at the two large orchids, and the more I think about where are they coming from, where are they situated in the landscape, where are we the viewers situated, the more it actually reminds me of the landscape paintings, and I'm thinking of Church's flag in the sky, where you've got, you basically have a scene, and then you've got large lights bursting forth from the sky. You've got explosions, you've got fireworks bursting forth, you've got a flag bursting forth. Here you've got orchids bursting forth. And that's what they're doing. They're not situated anywhere. They're kind of bursting forth from the sky. So in a way, it's that same mode, but with flowers and peace rather than flags and fireworks.
That's a really interesting observation. I love that idea that there might be a latent compositional relationship to lessons learned from church. Another painting that comes to mind with colors and lights bursting forth from the sky is Judith's Double Meteor, another of those great church pictures with light bursting out in the sky at the top of the composition. That's a really interesting point. I'd love to do a side-by-side analysis there and think about if these formulae are in direct relation. Yes?
So, there's so many things that you said that there's so much food for thought in what you talked about today. And part of it is the fact that when you focus on, say, as an artist, either flowers or animals, you are sort of lumped into a category of an animal illustrator or a floral illustrator. And in this painting, he has gone to Brazil. So perhaps he has found more that edifies him in the micro landscapes, in the close-up landscapes, in the intimate places. And this is such a perfect representation of not only the sort of the scientific aspects, the physical aspects, but the atmospheric aspects and the sort of spiritual aspects, I think. Orchids in South America, they grow on almost every tree. You'll have a single tree in the middle of a field and you get up there and there's like orchids just popping out everywhere. And you can see he's got 2 flowering orchids, but he's got a few other plants there that are clustered on the branch. And that atmosphere is so different than what we find here. So he is actually giving you an intimate look at a completely different landscape. And he's lighted it. He takes that shaft of light that passes down through the orchid and down onto the branch and lays that splash of light on the branch. So it's so much more than an illustration. Although it does have, it has a lot of scientific edification in it too.
Absolutely.
So I think it's, I love this whole series of his, and we've seen that, quite a few of those Heade paintings with the hummingbirds, and that's another aspect of that you really are brought up close to in rainforest down there. The number of these amazing hummingbirds that are always swooping back and forth. So he's bringing his audience these kind of precious jewels and laying them out there in a way that provides so much information.
This is a really helpful perspective. Everybody else in the room should know that I've been nervous about the perspective of my interlocutor here, who's a very distinguished botanical artist herself. So piecing together how that feels to go and engage directly with a flower, how it feels to be lumped into a category as somehow separate or illustrative. I've been really eager to hear Carol's perspective on all this. You've suggested in your comment there that's really helpful that maybe Heade is doing something that's not so different from what we think of church as doing, which is giving you armchair travel, giving you a privileged glimpse at the Andes, at an iceberg, these far off places that you'll probably never go yourself, and edifying you by so doing. So that's a useful corrective to my focus on all the ways this is different from church. You're quite right to say he's also giving us a sense of this immersive, overwhelming sensory environment. We can supply the sounds and the chirping insects and birds all around us, and indeed the bugs that are biting him as he's trying to get this image, the humidity of it, and we talked about technique there, the way he's getting that misty light of the jungle, the waterfall there, so there's water dense in the air. So maybe we should focus on that too. It is such a strange hybrid, and maybe it's successful in that way, giving you the useful scientific information, even as it also gives you that simple pleasure of feeling transported to a foreign realm.
A few years ago, I remember seeing, I think it was Sotheby's, a very large-scale late Heade from Florida. So it seems, in the context of your painting his biography, his career, did he end up trying to do something for marketing purposes, or his livelihood that was back in the old mode?
That's interesting. Yeah, we should look
Can you say a
more.
little bit about Florida?
Yeah, we should certainly look more at late Heade. What we know about Florida also can connect us back to Frederic Church, which is there's vivid correspondent at the end of both these men's lives. These near contemporaries. Heade is born before Church and lives a little bit longer than Church. And Church is expressing jealousy, frankly, about Heade's very productive late career in Florida, where he's not being hindered by rheumatoid arthritis. He's still painting right to the end of his life. So again, there's that little sharp edge to the letters Church is sending him, wishing that he still had that productivity that he clearly has. I'm not as familiar with that body of work, so we should look at it together. And if you are arguing that he is going back to a traditional realist mode, that would be really interesting. I would have expected that he would be doing sort of what Innes and others do, who have these long careers and change styles many times.
Let's put it this way, it wasn't a very evocative painting for 1890.
That seems interesting.
It seemed to have a lot of square footage to it. But
interesting. So maybe he is yet another of these people who, like Bierstadt, who couldn't really change, who couldn't really embrace the new, looser, brushier styles as Innes and others did so well.
So it sounds like the alternate title for our exhibition might have been "With Friends Like These Who Needs Enemies."
Yeah.
Except that Church in his letters, he does that with so many people.
Yeah.
And that's his sense of humor. You see it throughout his
It does have quite a cutting sense of humor. Yeah.
And he does a lot of
And he's
wordplay as
self-deprecating
well.
about himself.
Yeah.
He shows himself crawling along. This is our main sketch where he's crawling along with mosquitoes following him on the ground.
There are different concepts or percepts of nature. Does he include the human in his works?
Not very often in the jungle subjects and South American subjects, but he certainly does when he's painting the salt marshes. So we'll have a lovely one of those in the exhibition. As I mentioned, the proposal is to install it right above the fireplace here, where you see the people who are working these rather challenging environments that were considered wastelands in the time, the places that you couldn't farm in a traditional way, places that were dangerous, the soil was unreliable, and he does celebrate those people who are out there harvesting marsh grasses, and he gives you that kind of genre painting, charming anecdotes of everyday working life. Yet another art form that he dips in and out of as he sees fit. Our friends of Olana, the McGuigans, who have a collection that focuses on just 19th century American artists in Italy, they have a whole other side of Heade that is straight ahead genre painting, like charming street urchins in Italy. A whole other body of work so far removed. So he had many different careers, and there are times when he is fascinated by the human subject. Of course, we're not surprised by that because he starts as a portrait painter. He spent a lot of time thinking about human physiognomy and how you relate it. Later, it's much reduced in scale in his pictures, and it's just more visual interest and incident in a landscape or in a street scene, a cityscape. Yes.
Do we have any information about how he worked? Whether there are sketchbooks that he did, drawings that he did?
Mm-hmm.
Did he do color notation on those drawings like Church did?
Right. It's a good question. I've been learning more about that process for the purposes of this talk, so I'm glad you asked it. There is one rich letter from Church to Heade in which Church explicitly says, I advise you not to sketch so much as I have, because he felt like he was drowning in sketches and always sketching and always doing this background study and not just getting on with it. So there's that one brief glimpse into Church's process that he conveyed to Heade. He seems to have been less laborious a sketcher. I haven't seen those color notations that we think of, especially with Cole. He did such fascinating little notes on the coloristic content of his pictures rather than the scientific specificity that we often see in Church's sketching practice. It's usually a one-to-one correlation. We can point to one oil study of one orchid in a painting, and it usually is only that. There's not so much a lengthy practice of building up from pencil on paper to oil to eventual finish canvas. So he's a little bit more direct, a little bit faster in that working method. There's a very useful way of answering that question that shows up in the big Ted Stebbins catalog raisonné, where you contrast how Church built up to his great picture, Cotopaxi, and the Detroit Institute of Art's like a technicolor smoking volcano through long, steady processes of accumulation of information. And Heade approaching another volcano in the same country, also in Ecuador, I believe it is in this case, and then just getting down quickly on paper on a piece that is also devoted to an orchid, a multi-use piece of paper, the outline of the mountain, and then he just goes on to the finished thing. He wants to get that useful piece of information about the shape of that charismatic peak, and then get it into oil. So,
Now, there's such specificity here that you have to wonder how he remembered that.
Yes, indeed.
Without photography or without very finely delineated
Yes.
drawings.
So I think it was a quick oil study from the object, and that was his useful visual reference forevermore. And sometimes that would be in Brazil in the environment, and in other cases, like those dendrobium orchids, that pesky specimen at the bottom, it has to have been a botanical garden, an artificially created environment that gives you access to botany from around the world. If I'm not mistaken, you are the conservator who was working on this stuff. Yes, your name preceded it.
Long time.
That's great. It's great to have your perspective here. Do you have any perspective on the technical content of it? Have you ever had a chance to look at that?
When we treated that painting many years ago, we did not do technical analysis. So it would be something that would be interesting to do now.
Yes, indeed.
I have one.
The point that was made earlier about the proliferation and immersion in nature, and the reference was made to the gems of Brazil. When I saw them at Crystal Bridges, it was a block,
Yes.
as you may know, 4x4 of these equally sized frames. Is that the way you're intending to show them here?
We are in discussions. We have a great exhibition designer who's helping us. I'll give you the little privileged glimpse behind the scenes, the process. We're doing a lot of work to prepare for this exhibition. My working notion had been grids of 4 on either side of this window niche, and then the other 8 will be across the river at the Thomas Cole site. But we're starting to hone in on a rather more dramatic idea, so you'll have to see what our final decision is. It might be over in the other gallery there, temporary, used as our cloakroom, spotlights highlighting a row of 8 of them across the wall in a mostly darkened space. That might be a little more compelling. So what do we think? Which should it be?
Number 2.
Number 2? Yes.
Drama.
So, Will, one last question. You've talked so much about the relationship between our man Church and Heade. Can you tell us give us a little teaser of the other exciting painting that will be included in the exhibition?
Yes, thank you. That was a nice softball right down the middle of the That was my favorite things in this exhibition. So you'll have to keep your eyes peeled, and we will do everything we can in installation design to help this thing tell the stories it wants to tell. But there's going to be a really cool painting that is only about this big. So it's not going to grab you from a mile away like Heart of the Andes. We have dug up in a private collection of a veterinarian in Dallas, a painting that has not been seen in public for decades, called Gremlin in the Studio No. 1. It is a very strange testament to this friendship of Church and Heade. There's a better-known second version that's at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, but what we've got is the original, and it seems to have been a joke between friends made in the context of that 10th Street studio building, wherein Heade paints at the top part of this small, playful little picture, a watery salt marsh subject, one of those classic horizontal landscapes that he made so many of. But you see on reflection further down in the picture that it is a trompe-l'oeil, and the marsh is draining away onto the floor of an illusionistically painted studio. The top part reveals itself to have been a painting within a painting resting on some rustic sawhorses, and beneath the painting, mocking the painter's feeble efforts as his painting drains to naught, is a little gremlin who is perched on one foot mocking him. So it's a fascinating thing. There was a reception history in the period. Critics wrote about this strange painting and believed it to have been a collaboration between Church and Heade, where Heade is painting one of his many, many marshes, steps away to get a cup of coffee, and then Church rushes in and paints in the gremlin. It's a great story, but we haven't been able to find any conservation science to back that up. It looks like it was all the work of Heade, but a joke that he presented to Church. So my little pet theory, that is just a little idea that we can't back up just yet, is that this picture was a gift to Church that has since wandered off. Maybe it was even at Olana one day. And there are gaps in the provenance that allow for that to be possible. But because there were these two versions made, it seems to make sense that there was one for Heade and one for Church. The one in the Wadsworth came down in the Heade family. I believe this one was the Church gremlin.
I'd like to add one organizational note, which I think you touched on, but I wanted to say more clearly, is 5 years ago we did River Crossings. It was a collaboration with the Thomas Cole site and Olana. In order to see the exhibition, you had to go to both sites. It was really incredible. It led to what is now the Hudson River Skywalk project, which really makes these two artist homes and studios, this destination, connected by a walking route. Really an incredible project which launches next year. This year, the exhibition will be at both sites. In order to see it, you have to go to both sites. The gems will be split up between the two sites. But even more importantly, this is a collaboration also with the Crystal Bridges Museum of Art. These collections are coming from there, and this exhibition will travel then and end up at the Crystal Bridges. This is a first for us. It's a really important thing that's happening this year. So I don't know if you want to say more about it.
Great. It will be a really exciting moment for Olana with works from our collection, like a last tropical orchid, leaving us for a little while, going on the road. So the full tour after this co-hosted exhibition right here in this region is the Cummer Museum and Gardens in Jacksonville, Florida, the Reynolda House Museum of American Art in Winston-Salem, and then concludes at Crystal Bridges in 2021. So great Frederic Church paintings, great works from our permanent collection, parts of our permanent collection that have not been seen in public before, including little glimpses of this fascinating, deep collection of 19th century photography will also be included, a first glimpse, and we'll hope to explore that more in the future. So it should be a really exciting project.
Well, thank you.